Firstly, you need to make sure your case is suitable size wise and has enough slots for all your components. Careful of the edges, they can be sharp. You may need to wear an anti-static wrist strap just in case you can short circuit any of the components, so ideally don't touch them by the edges. Firstly, we're going to install the power supply. I'm using an ATX power supply as I have an ATX motherboard. This particular model is a 570 watts as I wanted to make sure it has enough power to power my graphics cards, my processors and my hard drives. Slide it into the top of the case as this is a top mounted power supply. Some actually mount at the bottom, but this particular one's mounted at the top. I need to make sure I line up the 4 screws and do them up nice and tight. Right, after checking that, I now need to move on to the I/O plate. This stops anything getting into the motherboard and helps keeping it in place. Click it into position, make sure it's round the right way, not upside down. Otherwise the motherboard simply won't fit. Once it's clicked into place, then you need to get hold of the motherboard and slide it into the I plate. Make sure all the wires are out of the way because you don't want any wires trapped underneath. You also need to make sure there isn't any additional pins sticking up from the mounting plate on the side of the case, as this can short the components and make sure they don't work. Slide them neatly under the I/O plate, line up all the screws. This particular motherboard has 6 screws, but some have 8, but because this is a micro ATX it only has 6 screws there. There is no need to over tighten the screws, because if you do, you can simply crack the motherboard and the motherboard will be useless. Here I'm just pointing out why I have done up all the 6 screws. Next I need to install the CPU. I'm using a socket 775 CPU. I'm going to lift the latch up. Some of these have a plastic cap covering the socket so you don't bend any of the pins, because if you bend the pins the CPU is useless, and so is the motherboard. Here I'm pointing out where pin 1 is. There's little notches as well to make sure you get it round the right way. You gently put it into the case opening and close the flap. I'm using a dual core processor here just because that's the type of specification I'm after. Now I will need to thinly apply a layer of silver thermal grease paste. This basically lets all the heat dissipate up to the heatsink and out to the fan, and as it was a retail CPU it came with its own heatsink and fan, so I know it is correct size and everything else. I'm using a spatula here, as I say, to thinly apply it over there. I don't want to put too much on because it can seep all over the edges of the CPU and mess up the socket. I'm going to add a little bit more to make a nice thin layer. Now I'm just turning the pegs round so that they will click into the motherboard. So as you can see, I'm just turn them anti-clockwise, and these need to line up with the 4 holes on the motherboard. So you'll see the 4 holes there each side of the processor socket. Carefully place it down. Make sure you're not sort of forcing anything down into place, so you don't want to bend the motherboard. In a moment I will place the power sensor and plug, which basically you can turn the speed of the processor fan up and down if your motherboard accepts that. Here I'm clicking the pegs into position, and you need to do it in like a cross pattern so that the weight's evenly distributed. There I've just plugged in the power supply there. Now these are DDR2 RAMs. You can get DDR3 now, but I'm in particular one using DDR2. 2 stocks. One's a 2 gig stick and one's a 1 gig stick. As I'm using a 32-bit operating system, because Windows only operates with 3 gig of RAM maximum when it's a 32-bit operating system. Carefully open the pins out, and what you need to do is make sure you have the DIMM or the DDR RAM socket in the right place. There's a little notch on the RAM sockets, and there's also a little notch also on the actual RAM strip. You need to carefully, without forcing it, slide it down into the peg edges, and without twisting it, make sure it lines up neatly and push it firmly into place, and the white pegs click over, locking the RAMs into place. That's the first RAM I've done. This is the second one. I'm using 2 of the same manufacturer just purely to try and get symmetrical RAM timings. Right, that's still in place. You'll see I'm just pushing down, that's clicked into place, and the other one has clicked into place as well. There we go, click. Right, after installing RAM, I need to install the 12 volt power to the CPU. It has its own little connector there. It has a little notch, so it only goes in one way, and that just simply clicks into place, and you want to make sure that the wire isn't going to interfere with the CPU fan, for obvious reasons. I will cable tie that neatly out the way afterwards. This is a 20 plus 4 pin power supply. Plugs into the motherboard there. Some have, the older motherboards have 20 pins, but this particular one has a 24 pin, so it will allow for a bit more powerful graphics card. Here the sticker tells us where all the pins for the front panel audio and front panel switches are, and you want to make sure that, for instance, the power LED, the plus and minus is round the right way and also onto the right pin. As you see, I'm just putting it onto the right way round, so that the plus and minus are round the right way, and if it's the wrong way round, the LED simply won't light up. Now I'm connecting the power switch. It doesn't really matter if you get this round the other way, because it's simply a switch. That obviously allows you to switch the computer on. Reset switch obviously resets it. And finally, so that you know if the hard drive is working, well, apart from you'd hear it, it flashes, so make sure to put your plus and minus round the right way as well. Now just pushing them onto the pins there. So if you're not sure, again, just double check. Some have manuals. This particular one I've stuck onto the case there, so if anyone else wants to do anything to it, they can see it there. This particular one has a speaker already built onto the motherboard, so I don't need to connect the case speaker, which tells you if there's any problems with memory and stuff. Now this is the USB. This particular one is for the front USB ports. You need to make sure pin 1 is round the right way, and it has a little pin missing on the board, so you know it's got the right rotation round, and it just simply presses on. And this particular one has 2 risers. Now I'm going to connect the front panel audio, so you can use the microphones and the headphone sockets in the front of there. And again, it only goes round one way, and it has a little key. It has 1 pin missing on the motherboard and 1 blocked out on the plug. Note on the floppy drive where pin 1 is, because you need to make sure the cable goes round the right way, and also the same with the power supply. You slide it in. This one also has a built-in card reader, so that's what the additional wire is. I will wire that up later on to one of the USB risers. Line up the front of the floppy drive so it lines up neatly with the case. You don't want it sticking out or anything else, and obviously screw into place. These are 2 screws on this side. There's also 2 screws on the other side as well. Obviously a lot of people nowadays don't bother with floppy drives. There's a card reader. It's basically the same as a USB thing there, so we'll connect it in a minute. This is the cable for the floppy drive. Now they have a red or a blue strip down where pin 1 is, and I already noted round where pin 1 is, so that could go around the right way. And obviously the same on the motherboard. I just push it down in the right rotation. Make sure it fits firmly. The power supply there, as I say, do not get that round the wrong way, otherwise you'll completely render your floppy drive useless, and also the card reader, the sort of for SD cards and stuff like that. And now I'm going to do the DVD-ROM drive. Now, as this goes by IDE cable, you can have 2 devices on 1 cable, so you need to make sure you select the pins to master and slave. As I'm only having 1, I'm going to leave that as master. Make sure that's lined up neatly with the front of the case, and then put the screws in. With the IDE cable, again, it has a red mark down where pin 1 is, and on the back of the DVD-ROM drive or CD-ROM drive, it actually has where pin 1 is printed, so you know you can get the rotation around the right way. Some have notches in so you can't physically get the cable around the wrong way, but people manage to force some in sometimes and ruin their devices. So I'm just screwing the screws up there to make sure the DVD-ROM drive is in the right place. Here I go. I'm going to collect the ID cable. It's a slightly wider ID cable because it has the 66 pins in there instead of the older 33 pins in there, which the older hard drives used to use. So it's basically a 66 plus ultra DMA transfer. And again, here you see it's got a notch taken out of it and a blanking plate, so you can only get it into the motherboard around the right way. I'm going to be using a serial ATA hard drive as they're faster, but with the IDE it doesn't really matter. Make sure you put the power, there's a 4-pin Molex that goes into the power supply, and make sure you put that round the right way. You can't really get it round the wrong way because it just doesn't fit. It's a serial ATA hard drive. This is a serial ATA 2, which is 1.5 gigabits per second. Note which way round the data and the power connectors are. It's like an L shape, so you have to make sure it's in the right way. Put it into one of the spare 3¼ inch or 3½ inch rather drive bays there. It's the DVD-ROM drives that go into the 5¼ inch, so that's a 3½ inch there. Just slide the holes up and do the screws up, and again you'll have 4 screws in total, so there's 2 this side and 2 on the other side, so do them up nice and tight, and that should stop it rattling, which you don't really want happening. And I go putting the second one in. Here we go, that's the other side there. Let's just say it's got sort of the other 2 screws there as well. That's serial ATA0, so that's with the first hard drive. Every drive has its own port with serial devices. So that's the serial data cable. Notice the L shape, and where the L shape goes onto the back of the drive, it locks into position. Some of the cheaper cables, they don't, they just slide on, and if you're not careful you can pull them back off, but this one has a special clip that locks into place. And I'm going to put that onto serial ATA0, which happens to be bottom one on this motherboard. As you can see, it takes 3 more serial ATA devices, being either DVD-ROM drives or extra hard drives. That's entirely up to the user. Now, need to make sure we put the power cable in. Some of these SATA drives have Molex cables. This particular one has its own dedicated serial ATA power supply. It is slightly different. It's got that L shape again. This is a rear case mounted fan. If you have a look at the rotation and the way the extraction of the air or the airflow is, we want to make sure it sucks the airflow is sucking outwards, so that's why I've just shown you where they are printed on this particular fan, and it's just 4 screws which hold it onto the back of the case there, and I'm just tightening them up there so I don't want it rattling around. Some actually take its power from a 4-pin Molex, the same as the DVD-ROM drives do, but this particular one has a 3-pin which plugs into the motherboard, so the motherboard can also tell you how fast it's rotating as well as powering it. I'm going to be using a PCI Express graphics card. This particular model is an NVIDIA one. It's a 9500 GT, it's 1 gig of RAM, and it's different to an AGP because of the length of the ports there. The port is longer, and it also has a device on top you can actually use if you want to, what we call SLI them, so you can join them together. But this particular motherboard only has 1 slot, so it's going to be a single graphics card in there, and I chose the NVIDIA just because that's my personal preference there. It's a little bit wobbly, but as long as I make sure the white clip locks it into place there. And you would also need to put the screw in on the case there just to stop it wobbling and give it more security there. It's just a simple case screw that will just screw down and hold that into place. Another expansion card I'm using is, I'm going to go for a Wi-Fi card here. This uses the PCI slot, so I don't use that Cat 5 there. If you want to use Cat 5, I do actually normally prefer Cat 5, but you can't always get it too near a router. That's the PCI card. And again, make sure it lines up, slides into position, click it down, and you need to put the screw into the case again to make it more stable. And this particular one has 3 aerials, some have 1 aerial. Again, personal preference really. The aerials just screw on. This is another expansion card I'm using. You can never have too many USB ports. That's the card reader which will plug onto this card here. The card reader from the floppy drive will just plug into the extra pins there, and it will also give me 4 more USB ports on the back there. And again, it just pushes into the PCI slot and screw it into place. And get the lead again, and just slide it onto the pins that are in there. You can use the modem ones if you want. The front, you see that it's got USB 2. I could plug it into one of those if I wanted to, but here I've got a key pin here again that only goes in one way. It's an additional 2 USB ports that are powered by the motherboard itself, and as I say, that will give me ample amount of USB ports, and it just pushes on just the same as the front mounted USB does. This time you need to make sure the L bracket slides back into the back of the case there, and fixes the same with a case screw, so just screw it down just to keep it nice and secure. If you're no longer adding any more cards to the motherboard, if you don't want any more expansion cards, you just basically put the locking plate on just to make it look a bit neater, locks them all into place, and stops fingers getting in there and anything else really. Now I'm going to put a side case fan on as well, just because the NVIDIA card sometimes gets a little bit warm there, and this one is going to be using a 4-pin Molex as opposed to plugging into the motherboard. And again, this one just screws on, but it has 2 screws because the side of the case actually has like 2 pins, if you like, already built on to stop it rotating. And as you can see there, it just plugs into the Molex port there, the 4-pin Molex power supply. I'm not going to plug it in yet, because I'm just going to cable tie all these wires up so that they're going to improve airflow and not going to get in the way of any fans and anything else, and it makes it look all neater there. So just cable ties. You can use twine if you wanted to, but I'm just, you know, the twiddly twine. I'm going to use cable tie. It looks neater, and just simply snip them off. And then once I've done that, I'll plug the fan back into the 4-pin Molex there to make sure it's powered on, and slide the side of the case on. It just simply slides on, make sure it's all locked into position. You can use regular case screws. I'm going to use thumb screws because I like to sometimes slide them off and make sure there's no dust in my case by regularly keeping it nice and clean. And once you've done, obviously, this side, you need to just sort of basically flip the case over and do the other side. So there's the other side, that's the motherboard side, and again, just line up the little tags and the latches, and it just slides into position. And you need to pick up 2 more of the thumb screws. This side's not so important to put thumb screws in. You can just keep this constantly screwed up, but I like to use thumb screws anyway, just so I can get every bit of dust out. And once that's done, the computer is ready for whatever operating system you feel free to put on it, whether you want to put Linux, Windows, or any of the sorts, but I tend to use Microsoft Windows, and because it's 3 gig RAM, we're going to use the 32-bit operating system, as I say. And there you go, that's all ready to be used.